The chamber was old. Not old the way a building gets old. Cracked walls, dust in the corners, paint peeling off in sad strips. Old the way a mountain is old. Old the way something gets when it has watched everything else come and go and is still standing. The ceiling was carved from a single piece of black stone, pulled from a dead planet 3 galaxies away. The floor was inlaid with the names of every species that had ever sat in this room and made a decision that mattered. There were a lot of names. Some of them did not have living speakers anymore. Counselor Vreth Sanok walked to his seat at the head of the great curved table and said nothing. He did not need to. He had been doing this for longer than most species in the room had been spacefaring. He had the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having run out of things that surprise you. He was Keth, gray-skinned, four-armed, with eyes the color of old copper. His people had been among the stars for 11,000 years. He had personally overseen the Council's response to 4 civilizational crises. He had cast the deciding vote on 3 of them. He settled into his seat and looked at the agenda. One item, the human question. Around the curved table sat the representatives of 47 species. Some had traveled weeks to be here. The Dorvan ambassador was a towering creature that needed a separate atmospheric pod just to breathe the room's recycled air. The twin Shal delegates sat motionless in their shared chair, perfectly synchronized the way Shal always were, finishing each other's sentences and sharing a single glass of water. The Makari contingent occupied the far left seats and had already submitted 17 procedural objections before the session even opened, which was normal for Makari and which everyone ignored, which was also normal. Every one of these species had been in space for centuries. The youngest among them, the Pelosi, who were considered newcomers and were gently condescended to at every social gathering, had achieved faster than light travel 400 years ago. Humanity had been spacefaring for 63 years. 63. Vreth Sanok let the number sit in his mind the way you let a stone sit in your hand. Feeling the weight. 63 years. His own species had spent the first 300 years of space travel just mapping their own solar system. When humans had spent 63 years and somehow ended up with 17 orbital stations, 4 colony worlds, 24 deep space mining operations, and a seat at the table nobody invited them to, but nobody had technically told them they couldn't have. That last part was the problem. Junior analyst Peth Saran, young, nervous, the kind of person who triple checks everything and still apologizes for being wrong, placed the briefing document in front of each delegate. Physical copies. Vreth Sanok had insisted. Things felt more real when you could hold them. The document was 40 pages. Most delegates would read the summary on the first page and call it done. The summary said, in plain language, humanity presents an unacceptable long-term strategic risk to Galactic Council stability and should be addressed before the window closes. The word addressed was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Vreth Sanok had written it himself. He opened the session. The translator bead behind his left ear hummed as his words converted into 47 simultaneous streams. Somewhere in that hum was a version of his voice speaking in the clicking throat language of the Dross, the deep bass rumble of Makari formal speech, the whistling tonal dialect of the high mountain shawl. He had spoken in this room so many times that he barely noticed the hum anymore. The matter before the council, he said, is not complicated. He believed that. He genuinely did. He laid it out in clean, simple terms. So humanity's growth rate was irregular. Not just fast, irregular, which was different and more concerning. Most young species followed a predictable development curve. They expanded, hit resource limits, slowed, negotiated, eventually stabilized into the broader galactic order. Humanity did not follow the curve. Humanity looked at the curve, apparently decided it was a suggestion, and went sideways. Their population growth was accelerating, not leveling. Their territorial expansion had jumped 30% in the last 8 years alone. Their industrial output had tripled in a decade. And 3 separate intelligence reports, none of which had been shared broadly, Vreth Sanok noted carefully, indicated deep space construction activity that could not be fully accounted for by the permits on file. Nobody asked what that last part meant. They all knew what it meant. They just did not want to say it out loud in a room where the words would be recorded. The Dorvan ambassador, Keshra Mul, raised one of its 6 limbs. Its translator box rendered its voice as something that sounded like a cello being played in a cathedral. Is there evidence of hostile intent? It asked. There is evidence of capability development, Vreth Sanok said. At their current rate, hostile intent becomes a secondary concern. The capability itself is sufficient. That was also true. He believed that too. The Pelosi delegate, Ambassador Suri, was young enough to still show things on her face. She was showing something now. Not disagreement exactly. More like the look a person gets when they hear an argument they can't immediately counter, but know is wrong somewhere in the middle where it's hard to point to. They are 63 years old, she said. Yes, Vreth Sanok said. We were not held to this standard at 63 years. You were not growing at this rate at 63 years. Suri looked down at her briefing document. She didn't answer. The debate ran for 4 hours. It was detailed, procedural, thorough, and largely irrelevant. The votes were already decided before anyone walked into the room. That is the way these things always work. The debate is for the record. The record is for history. History, Vreth Sanok had long since concluded, mostly reads whatever it wants into the documents anyway. The Makari submitted 3 more procedural objections, all denied. Was the Shal delegates asked twice whether diplomatic contact had been fully exhausted. The answer given was that humanity had been difficult to engage formally. This was accurate. What was not said was that the engagement attempts had been minimal, brief, and not pursued after initial complexity. The record would not reflect that distinction. Ambassador Suri of the Pelosi sat through the final arguments with her hands flat on the table. She was doing the thing Vreth Sanok recognized. The thing young diplomats do when they know they are going to lose and are trying to decide whether losing quietly is the same as agreeing. It is not, but it feels that way from the inside. The vote came at the session's 4th hour. Vreth Sanok read the motion aloud. Preemptive civilizational correction of the Human Territorial Compact. Out an authorization of a council enforcement fleet. Immediate action. He had drafted the language himself. It was clean and precise and said everything without saying anything. He called for the vote. 43 in favor, 4 abstentions. The Pelosi, the Dross, 2 others whose names were recorded and filed and not followed up on, which everyone in the room understood was also a message. No votes against. Nobody voted against. Voting against on a matter like this required a formal counter-proposal and 3 sessions of procedural review. The abstentions were the resistance, small and quiet and shaped exactly like silence. Vreth Sanok noted the abstentions, filed them, moved on. The briefing for Fleet Admiral Chauvel was prepared that afternoon. 19 warships, 3 destroyer class, 8 battle cruisers, 8 support vessels. More than sufficient, the briefing noted, for a civilization operating at humanity's current confirmed military capacity. Confirmed. Peth Soran, the nervous junior analyst who triple-checked everything, flagged the word in his private notes. Confirmed was based on what the council had been able to verify. There were, he noted quietly in a document he filed under a low-priority heading that nobody read, several areas of human military development that remained unverified. Not because the information didn't exist, because the request for verification had been deprioritized in the rush toward the vote. He flagged it. He filed it. He went home. The fleet departed the next morning, 19 ships in clean formation, their warp signatures cutting through space like a signature being written. Admiral Chauvel was experienced, decorated, and quietly contemptuous of the assignment. 19 ships against a civilization that still used chemical propellant for its early-stage launches. He had brought 19 ships the way a person brings an umbrella when there is a 5% chance of rain, not because they expect to need it, but because leaving it behind would have been embarrassing. In his personal log that first evening, he wrote one line. This will be over in 3 days. He was wrong about the number of days. He was wrong about a great many things, it turned out. Back in the council chamber, Vreth Sanok sat alone after the session closed. The other delegates had gone to their respective quarters or transports, or the diplomatic reception that the Makari were hosting on Level 4. He had declined the reception. He always declined receptions. He sat and looked at the table, at the names carved into the floor. He was old enough to remember two of them, two species whose names were down there in the stone because they were gone. One had destroyed itself. One had been, well, the language used at the time had been different. Civilizational realignment. The concept was the same. He did not feel bad about those decisions. He had made them with full information and correct reasoning, and they had been right. He was certain of that. He looked at the table. He thought about Suri's face, the look she'd had. He thought about the unverified sections of the briefing. He thought about 19 ships traveling through space right now, confident, unhurried, carrying the Council's full authority, and a fleet commander who had not been briefed on what wasn't confirmed. He thought about all of this for 11 minutes. Then he went to the reception. The food was very good. The Makari, whatever their procedural faults, set an excellent table. He ate well. He talked to people. He laughed once at something the Dorvan ambassador said, though he couldn't remember what it was by the time he walked back to his quarters. He slept without difficulty. 17 light hours away, the fleet was moving. Something was already waiting for it. It had been waiting for a while. The fleet came out of warp 17 light hours from Earth, 19 ships, clean formation, everything exactly as planned. Admiral Chauvel stood on the bridge of the Sovereignty's Hand, a battlecruiser that was, by any reasonable measure, a magnificent piece of military engineering, and watched the system resolve on the main display. Stars settling, distances calculating, the pale blue dot of the human homeworld sitting right where the chart said it would, small and distant and perfectly ordinary. He felt in an honest moment he would never have admitted to anyone, a small disappointment. He had hoped for something worth looking at. Sensor sweep, he said. Operator Vane Pole ran the sweep. Data populated across the board. The system was more cluttered than the last intelligence summary had shown. Humans built fast, apparently, even in their own backyard. But nothing concerning. Orbital stations, small and functional looking, 17 by the count, clustered mostly around Earth in the second planet they'd been colonizing. A network of communication relays, fuel depots, the kind of infrastructure a young species builds when it is still figuring out that space is very large and very empty and requires a lot of preparation. And ships, human patrol vessels, already detected, already responding. They were breaking formation, scattering, moving away from the fleet at maximum burn on drives that Vanepole systems read as old-generation ion propulsion. "They're running," said Commander Teleroche from navigation. She did not bother to hide the satisfaction in her voice. "Let them," Chauvel said. "Log the positions. We'll collect them after." He walked to the center of the bridge and clasped his hands behind his back. This was a posture he had spent 40 years perfecting. It communicated calm authority without effort. His crew responded to it without knowing why. "Arn, move us to intercept course for the primary orbital station. Standard approach. Broadcast Council authorization codes on all open channels." He thought about adding, "Give them a chance to respond," but didn't. The briefing had been clear. This was not a negotiation. Vanepole ran the approach calculations. Teleroche confirmed the broadcast was active. The fleet began its slow, deliberate move toward Earth, the kind of movement that is designed to be seen, to be understood as inevitable, to remove the illusion of choice before the first shot is ever fired. Chauvel watched the display. Earth got slightly larger. The human patrol ships kept running. It was going exactly as expected. Then Vanepole made a small sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when they see something that their brain has not yet agreed to accept. A kind of involuntary intake of breath that stopped halfway. Chauvel turned. "Report." Vanepole was looking at his sensor board. He was looking at it the way a person looks at a bill that is much larger than they expected. Several seconds passed. "There is a reading," Vanepole said carefully, "at the edge of the system. Human vessel. The transponder is not broadcasting anything I have in the database." Vanepole's voice was the controlled flat tone of someone who has been trained to not show alarm and is currently testing that training very hard. "It is registering as a single object. Stationary. Size?" Another pause, longer this time. "Running the calibration again," Vanepole said. I didn't ask you to run it again. I asked you for a size. Paul looked up from his board. He had copper eyes like most of his species, but right now they had gone slightly wide at the edges. The reading is returning a mass equivalent to a small moon, he said. I am running the calibration again because the first two runs return the same number, and I want to confirm the equipment is not malfunctioning. The bridge went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a disciplined crew. The other kind. The kind that comes when 12 trained professionals all have the same thought at the same moment, and none of them want to be the first to say it out loud. Chauvel looked at the display. At the edge of the system, at the very border of what their sensors could reliably read, there was a marker. Pale, stationary. The system had placed a question mark next to it because the classification protocols did not have a category that fit. Energy output, he said. Mid-sequence stellar range. Paul said it quickly now, like pulling off something that was stuck. It is not a star. The energy signature is structured, directed. It is coming from the object itself, not radiating outward. Chauvel stared at the question mark on his display. It didn't move when we arrived. No, sir. It didn't power up. No, sir. Based on the energy readings, it was already at full operational status when we came out of warp. It has not changed state since our arrival. Chauvel thought about that. He thought about what it meant that something at the edge of a system sits at full operational status and does not react when 19 warships drop out of warp into the same system. There were two explanations for that kind of stillness. Either it had not noticed them, or it had noticed them immediately and did not consider them worth reacting to. He pushed that second explanation away. Hail it. Paul opened a channel on all known frequencies. Council Standard, Galactic Common, 3 emergency protocols. The broadcast went out and sat in space and came back as silence. Nothing. Hail it again on... The channel opened, not from their end, from the other side. The communication request came through on a frequency that Paul stared at for a moment before confirming that it was not a frequency in the Council's standard database. It was something else, something the Sovereignty's hand systems had received perfectly well and had absolutely no record of. Chauvel straightened, adjusted the clasp of his uniform jacket. This was habit, not vanity, the physical act of composing himself. Put it through. The voice that came through was human. He recognized the cadence from the language files he'd reviewed during the transit. Standard Earth English, the dominant dialect in Council diplomatic correspondence. It was a woman's voice. She sounded the way a person sounds when they are making a call they have been expecting for a long time and are not particularly moved by. Admiral, we've been watching you since Kepler Station. Chauvel felt something in his chest that he would later describe, only to himself, as the physical sensation of a floor shifting under you. Not falling, just shifting, moving slightly, reminding you that you had assumed it was solid and had not actually checked. Kepler Station was 17 light hours behind them. They had passed through its sensor range in warp transit. They had not slowed, had not broadcast, had made no detectable contact. The mathematics of it should have made them invisible. She had said, watching. I'd recommend you hold your current position, the voice continued. Not a request. The phrasing was soft. The thing under the phrasing was not. Chauvel looked at Paul, who was doing something on his board that he was doing very carefully and very quietly. Sinar Telerosh at navigation had turned from her console and was looking at Chauvel with an expression that asked the same question she was too well trained to say out loud. What is that thing? What Chauvel knew, standing on the bridge of a ship that was designed to feel like the most powerful thing in any room it entered, was this. The object at the edge of the system was a vessel. It had been built, someone had made it, and the person who had made it had given a woman a channel and a script and sent her out here to speak in a calm voice to a council admiral 17 light hours from the ship's home planet, which meant they had known this was coming, which meant the fleet's departure, the route, the timeline, all of it had been anticipated. His mind went back to the briefing, the 19 ships, a more than sufficient for a civilization at humanity's confirmed military capacity. He heard that word now, the way a person hears a sound after the window breaks. understanding it fully only in the aftermath. Confirmed. "Who is this?" he said. "Admiral Captain Renata Vasquez, Commanding Officer, UES Thermopylae." A brief pause. "That's the ship you're looking at, in case the designation wasn't in your database." "It probably isn't." It wasn't. "We have council authorization for this approach," Chauvel said. He kept his voice level. He had a good voice for this. Deep, unhurried, carrying the weight of 40 years and a decorated record. "You are advised to stand down and permit the council fleet to—" "I know what your orders say," Vasquez said. "I've read them." Silence. "How?" he said, and stopped. One, because there was no good end to that question. "Admiral, I really would hold position." "Not unkind. What happens next is going to require your full attention, and you're going to want to be stopped when it does." Chauvel looked at the question mark on his display. He thought about standing orders, about the council's authority, about 19 ships and a mission that was supposed to be finished in 3 days. He looked at the energy readings next to that pale marker at the edge of the system. Mid-sequence stellar range, structured, directed, coming from something that had been sitting there at full operational status, waiting without moving, without hailing, without reacting in any way to the arrival of 19 Council warships, for reasons that, Chauvel now understood, had nothing to do with not noticing. He thought about all of this. The channel was still open. Vasquez was not saying anything more. She had said what she needed to say and was apparently content to wait. Outside, 17 light hours away, Earth turned on its axis. Billions of lives, busy and small and completely unaware that 19 ships were currently in their system and that an old diplomat had cast a vote in a room made of black stone. The Thermopylae sat at the edge of the system. It did not move. Chauvel looked at his navigation officer. He gave the order to continue approach. Later, much later, in a deposition he would give before the council's review board, he would be asked why he had not heeded the warning. He would think about that for a long time before answering. The honest answer was simple. He had not believed it. The floor had shifted under him, and he had looked down and decided the floor was fine and kept walking. That is what certainty does to a person. That is what it costs. The order took 12 seconds to execute. That was how long it took for Chauvel's firing command to travel down the chain, from his mouth to Teleroche at navigation, from navigation to weapons, from weapons to the 3 destroyers' running point at the fleet's forward edge. 12 seconds of clean, practiced military procedure. The kind of procedure that has been drilled so many times it happens without thought, without hesitation, without the small friction of doubt. The 3 destroyers locked targeting solutions on the Thermopylae. Standard protocol was a single warning discharge followed by a demand to stand down. Chauvel had waived the warning discharge. And there was a provision for that. He had used it. The weapon systems confirmed lock. "Fire," Chauvel said. Nothing fired. Not a malfunction. Not a hesitation in the system. The weapons were ready. The lock was confirmed. The order was given. Nothing fired because in the space between the order leaving Chauvel's mouth and reaching the weapons officer's hands, something happened to the 3 destroyers at the front of his fleet that his brain took several full seconds to understand. They stopped. Not slowed, not pushed off course. Stopped. The way you stop when you step in something that grabs your foot. The way you stop when the thing you were walking through turns out to be solid. All 3 of them simultaneously, at the exact moment the targeting locks were confirmed, and simply ceased forward movement and hung in space as if the universe had decided they were done going anywhere. The Sovereignty's hands bridge erupted. Not in panic, his crew was too good for that, but in the specific controlled chaos of trained professionals dealing with something their training had not prepared them for. Reports came in from all 3 destroyers. Power nominal, engines at full thrust. No external impact detected. The ships were pushing, their drives burning hot and going nowhere. Van Pol looked up from his board. His voice was very quiet. "Sir, I'm reading a localized gravity field around all 3 vessels. Source is the Thermopylae." A pause. "It is not a weapon type in our database. Range on the field? It appears to be exactly around the 3 ships, not wider. Not affecting anything else." Chauvel stared at the tactical display. Three destroyer icons sitting perfectly motionless in space while the rest of the fleet held position around them. The gravity readings were off his scale. Whatever was holding those ships, it was not a projection of force in any form he had encountered in 4 decades of military service. Then the destroyers were released, just like that. One moment held, the next moment free. All three of them lurched forward as their engines, still burning at full thrust, suddenly had somewhere to go. Telerosh called out course corrections. The destroyers scrambled to avoid collision. For 30 seconds, the front of the fleet was a controlled mess of ships recovering their positions. Vasquez's voice came back on the open channel. Hey, that was the minimum setting. 3 words after. Unhurried. I want to be very clear about that. Chauvel's hands were on the edge of his command console. He became aware of this because his knuckles were pressed against the surface, hard enough to ache. He made himself straighten, made himself breathe. He had been in combat. Real combat, not drills. He had been on a bridge when things were genuinely dangerous, and he had managed it because he understood the shape of it. Understood the weapons, the distances, the logic. Military experience is not just learning how to fight. It is learning how to read what you're fighting and respond from a place of knowledge instead of fear. He had no knowledge to read this from. The Thermopylae had stopped 3 warships with something that didn't exist in his database. It had done it at exactly the right moment. Not before, not after, but precisely when the targeting locks were confirmed, which meant its systems had read his systems faster than his systems had read themselves. And it had used minimum setting. It had said so. Van Pol, he said, what are we looking at? I've been trying to classify the vessel since we first detected it. Van Pol had pulled up everything he had and laid it across his board. It is not a class in any catalog I have access to. The mass reading is consistent. We are looking at a structure that is approximately 6 kilometers in length, 4 in the broadest dimension. Telerosh made a sound from navigation. She had not meant to. She covered it. 6 kilometers. The Sovereignty's hand was 800 meters long and was considered a large vessel. In armament, Chauvel said, I can read energy signatures consistent with multiple weapon systems. Van Pol looked at his board a moment too long. The gravity projection is only one of them. There are at least 4 other energy readings I cannot categorize. He looked up. Admiral, the energy output of that vessel is comparable to a star, not a weapon. The ship itself. The channel crackled. Vasquez again. Admiral, I'm going to need you to stay on the line while I do something. A brief pause, during which the sound of someone typing could be clearly heard. Okay, check your communications board. Van Pol looked at the board. His face did a thing it had not done before in this encounter. A thing Chauvel would remember specifically because Van Pol had been his sensor operator for 9 years and was not a person who showed surprise easily. She's broadcasting, Van Pol said. Broadcasting what? Everything. A long pause. Admiral, she is transmitting a full recording of this engagement. Our approach, the targeting locks, the gravity demonstration, on a frequency that I cannot identify, at a power level that I cannot account for, and the signal is... He stopped. Started again. The signal is directional. It is going to specific destinations. Another pause. The destinations are the home systems of every council member species, including the council chamber itself. On the tactical display, the Thermopylae sat perfectly still. 6 kilometers of it, waiting. Sir, Telerosh said from navigation. Her voice was very careful. The 3 destroyer commanders are asking for orders. Chauvel said nothing. He was doing math. Not the kind of math that uses numbers, but the kind that uses facts. And he was arranging the facts in a row and looking at what they added up to. Humanity, 63 years spacefaring. A vessel that could stop 3 warships with minimum setting and feed the recording directly to the council chamber in real time. A calm voice on the other end of a channel on a frequency that wasn't in his database. We've been watching you since Kepler Station. 40 years, the briefing had said. 40 years of deep space construction activity that couldn't be fully accounted for by the permits on file. 40 years. He thought about what you could build in 40 years if nobody was looking. If everyone around you had decided in advance that you were too young and too small to be worth watching carefully. He thought about what you could do inside mining operations and fuel depots and geological survey platforms if the inspection teams were sent on a schedule you had been provided in advance. Sir, Telerosh said again. Stand down weapons, he said. The weapons officer confirmed. The targeting locks disengaged across the fleet. Admiral Captain Vasquez, Chauvel said. Yes. You said you have been watching since Kepler Station. I want to understand the scope of what you're telling me. The scope, Vasquez said, is that we've known about the Council's vote since 12 hours after it happened. We've known about this fleet since it was assembled. We've been tracking your route since departure. A pause. You used standard Council transit lanes the whole way. That's the part that I think was maybe a little overconfident, if I'm being honest with you. Chauvel thought about the transit lanes, about how using standard lanes was standard procedure, efficient, sensible, and apparently about as discreet as announcing your route in a public broadcast. In the council chamber, he knew this now because Vasquez had just sent them a live feed. 47 species were watching 3 warships hang frozen in space. We're watching them release like a hand opening. We're watching the same tactical display Chauvel was watching in real time from 17 light hours away on a frequency that didn't exist in any database. He imagined Vreth Sanok in that chamber. He imagined the look on the old counselor's face. He hoped very specifically that he was not in that room right now. What is your intent? Chauvel said. My intent is to talk, Vasquez said, but not to you. A brief silence. No offense. None taken, he said, and was surprised to discover he meant it. There was something about her voice, the flatness of it, the total absence of gloating, that he found against all reasonable expectation easier to deal with than anger would have been. Anger he knew how to navigate. This kind of calm was different. This was the calm of someone who has won and knows it and does not feel the need to perform the winning. You're going to want to hold position, she said. What I'm about to send to the council is going to require some time for them to process, and I'm going to need to keep this channel clear. Are you threatening the council? He had to ask. Protocol required it. I'm about to make 3 requests, Vasquez said. Whether they're threats is really up to the council. Another pause. You should probably eat something while you wait. This is going to take a while. The channel went quiet. Not closed, just quiet. The Thermopylae sat at the edge of the system, 6 kilometers of things that had no name in the database, and waited with the specific patience of something that has been waiting for a long time already and is not bothered by a little more. Around it, 17 light hours from the pale blue dot of a homeworld that 80 years ago had not known the galaxy was full of other people. Humanity waited too. In the council chamber, the recording played. Nobody spoke. And 3 ships, frozen, released, minimum setting. The Dorvan ambassador's atmospheric pod was making a low hum. It always made that hum, the same as always, the same as before. Nothing had changed about the hum. Everything else had changed. The emergency session started at the 4th hour after the broadcast. It should have started sooner. There were 47 species represented in the council, and most of them needed time to reach their diplomats, brief their governments, and receive instructions that in many cases came back as we don't know either. Use your best judgment, which was the diplomatic equivalent of being handed an empty bag and told to fill it. The chamber looked the same as it always did. Black stone ceiling, names carved in the floor, with a slight hum of 47 atmospheric systems, keeping 47 different sets of lungs alive and functioning. Vreth Sanok was at the head of the table. He looked the same as he always did too. Still, copper-eyed, 4 hands resting on the table, with the deliberate calm of someone who is controlling their hands very carefully. The recording played again at the start of the session. Some delegates watched it. Some watched the table. Some watched Vreth Sanok watching the table. When it finished, the room fractured. Not slowly, not politely. The Makari contingent was on its feet before the recording finished, all 5 members speaking simultaneously in their layered bass-tone language. Their translator boxes producing something that sounded like 5 arguments stacked on top of each other, which was an accurate description of the content. The Shal delegates completed each other's sentences so fast they sounded like a single panicking person. The Dorvan ambassador, Keshra Mul, sat very still in its atmospheric pod and said nothing, which from a Dorvan was the loudest possible response. Three factions assembled themselves within the first 20 minutes, the way factions always do in a crisis. Not through deliberate organization, but through the natural gravity of shared fear. The first faction said commit the reserve fleet, 200 ships. End it now, before this spreads further, before whatever humanity has built gets any bigger or any bolder. They were loud. They were scared in the way that makes people sound angry, which is the most dangerous kind of scared. The second faction said stop, immediate ceasefire. He recalls Chauvel's fleet. Open formal diplomatic channels. The vote was premature and must be reversed, and there is still a window to fix this before it becomes something that cannot be fixed. Ambassador Suri of the Pelosi was in this group. She had her hands flat on the table again, which Vreth Sanak had now identified as her posture for situations where she was right and could not yet prove it. The third faction was the one that grew. It started with 3 delegates, and by the second hour it was 12, and by the fourth hour it was 22, which was the largest single block in the room. They were not arguing about what to do. They were asking a question that nobody in the first 2 factions wanted to answer, because answering it required looking directly at something very uncomfortable. How? And how had humanity built it without anyone knowing? This was the question that mattered, not the ship itself. The ship was a fact now, sitting at the edge of a solar system, and facts require response but not explanation. What required explanation was the 40 years, the permits, the inspections, the intelligence reports that had flagged unverified construction activity and been deprioritized, the briefing that had been built on confirmed data and had sent 19 ships into a system that was waiting for them. Junior analyst Peth Saran was not in the room. He was in a small office on the 14th administrative level, which is where junior analysts are during emergency sessions of the council, because their access clearance does not extend to the chamber floor. He was sitting at his desk with the document he had filed under a low-priority heading open on his screen. The document was 42 lines long. He had written it 9 days ago. It flagged the gap between confirmed and unconfirmed data in the pre-mission briefing. It noted several areas of human military development that had been marked as low priority for verification due to time constraints. It had been filed. It had been read by no one. He was reading it again now. He was reading it the way a person reads something they wish they had shouted louder. Back in the chamber, a senior intelligence coordinator named Veltan was presenting what he had assembled in the 4 hours since the broadcast. He was an unhappy man under normal circumstances, and he was very unhappy now. The picture he presented was this. Humanity had applied for deep space construction permits consistently for 38 years. The permits covered mining operations, fuel refinement platforms, long-range survey outposts, and several categories of industrial infrastructure. Every permit was filed correctly. Every fee was paid on time. When council inspection teams were scheduled, the humans had cooperated fully, and the inspection reports had all returned clean. The reason the inspection reports had returned clean was that every structure being inspected was exactly what the permits described. From the outside, Veltan pulled up a diagram. Structural analysis, done in the last 4 hours by a team that had been awake since the broadcast, and showed it. The diagram showed a standard human deep space mining platform. Large, functional, boring, on exactly what the permit said it was. Then the diagram shifted to show a different view. An interior cross-section that the inspection teams had never seen, because the inspection teams had inspected the exterior facing and the operational levels and had not gone into the substructure because the permits did not cover substructure, and there was no protocol for inspecting what wasn't in the permit. Inside the mining platform substructure was a dry dock. Inside the dry dock was a frame. Veltan showed 7 more diagrams, 7 platforms, 7 dry docks, 7 frames in different stages of completion, going back across 30 years of permit records that no one had ever cross-referenced against each other because they were filed under different categories in different regional databases. 7 Titan-class vessels, built inside structures that were genuinely, actually operationally the things they claimed to be. The mining platforms mined, the fuel refineries refined, The survey outposts surveyed, and inside each one, in the structural skeleton that nobody had a protocol to inspect, humans had been building for 40 years. The chamber was quiet, not the quiet of people thinking, the quiet of people having finished thinking and not liking the answer. They didn't hide it, said one of the 12 faction delegates. Her name was Ambassador Priel, and she was Shao, and she had the particular Shao quality of stating things clearly at the exact moment everyone else wished someone would not. The records are all there. The permits, the inspection reports, the development logs. Nothing was falsified. Then how? Someone started. We didn't look. She said it simply. There are 47 species on this council with intelligence services that have been operating for centuries. None of them looked because we had all decided already what humanity was. Young, small, not worth close attention yet. She paused. They relied on that. They built the most significant military development in 2 generations inside the gap between what we assumed and what we verified. Vreth Sanok had not spoken since the session opened. He had listened to all of it. The faction arguments, the intelligence briefing, Priel's summary. He had kept his hands flat and his face still and let the room talk itself into the shape it needed to take. He was thinking about a specific thing. In his long career, he had made decisions about young civilizations. He had applied reasoning that he believed was correct and responsible, and in the long interest of galactic stability. You watch them develop. You assess the risk curve. You act before the window closes. This was accepted council practice. It had been applied to others before humanity. The others had not built anything inside their windows. They had not anticipated the assessment, had not looked at the council's attention the way a person looks at a gap in a fence and thinks, that is where I go. They had not spent 40 years being exactly what was expected of them on the surface while doing something completely different underneath. He had cast the deciding vote. He had done it on confirmed data. He understood now what confirmed had meant. Confirmed meant the things they had pointed a sensor at. The things they had thought to check. The things that fit the assumption. The assumption was that 63 years was young, small, not yet. He looked at the names carved in the floor. How many of them had council votes attached to them? The reserve fleet question, said the first faction lead, a hard-voiced Makari named Gostun. We still have 200 ships. We can... No, Vreth Sanok said. It was the first word he had said in the session. The room settled. He did not explain. He looked at Gostun and waited. We cannot commit the reserve fleet, Gostun said finally, translating Vreth Sanok's silence into the words it contained, because we don't know what we're committing it against. He looked like a person who had just picked up something heavy and discovered it was heavier than it appeared. Ian, they said 7 ships. We don't know if that's true. We don't know what else is in those substructures. We don't know what else is in the permits we didn't cross-reference. A pause. We don't know what we don't know. Correct, Vreth Sanok said. In the quiet that followed, the Dorvan ambassador's pod hummed. The 4 abstaining delegates from the vote, the ones whose abstentions had been noted and filed and not followed up on, sat very still and said nothing, and had the specific expression of people who have had an opinion for a while and have been waiting for the room to catch up. Suri looked at Vreth Sanok across the table. It was not an accusatory look. It was a careful, clear look that said, we are past the point where blame is useful, and I would like to help fix this. Hooray, and I need you to let me. He gave her a small nod. She looked down at her document. The channel to the Thermopylae had been open the whole time, sitting quiet, waiting. On the bridge of the Sovereignty's hand, Admiral Chauvel had eaten something and was staring at the tactical display and had not moved in 2 hours. Vasquez had said the council would need time to process. She had been right about that. She had been right about a lot of things. The Thermopylae sat at the edge of the system. Waiting. It was good at waiting. It had been practicing for 40 years. The channel opened at the 19th hour, not because the council was ready, because Vasquez opened it, which was a distinction that everyone in the chamber understood and nobody acknowledged out loud. 19 hours? It's 47 species and centuries of combined diplomatic experience and the most sophisticated deliberative body in the known galaxy. and humanity had given them 19 hours and then picked up the channel. "We're done waiting," Vasquez said. 7 words. Vreth Sayanok had spent 19 hours preparing for this moment. He had his notes. He had the Council's legal team standing by. He had a proposed framework for phased diplomatic engagement and a draft resolution on provisional consultation status and a procedural path toward a formal review of the original vote. He had a very full document. He looked at the document. He set it aside. "Admiral Captain Vasquez," he said, "the Council is prepared to engage." Good. She was not warm about it, but she was not cold either. She had the tone of someone conducting a meeting they expected to go a certain way and had no strong feelings about. "I have 3 points. I'll go through them once. I want them on the record as stated, and I'd like the Council to respond to each before we move on." She went through them. She did not hurry. She did not soften them. She went through them the way a person goes through a list they have thought about for a long time and arrived at with care. Point 1. The preemptive civilizational correction order was to be rescinded, not suspended, not reviewed, rescinded permanently. Humanity was to be granted full sovereignty status in the Council, not candidate status, not provisional membership with restricted voting, not observer classification with a 5-year pathway to review, full status, immediate, effective the moment the resolution was signed. Point 2. Every species that had voted in favor of the correction order was to submit to a formal independent audit of their own early space age military development records. Humanity wanted to see the standard applied consistently. They had a specific interest in whether other young civilizations had been assessed on the same basis as humanity had been. The audit would be conducted by a panel that included human representatives. Point 3. The Council was to adopt a binding resolution acknowledging that humanity's military and technological development constituted independent discovery entirely within human territory without violation of any Council law or treaty that humanity had been party to, and was therefore not subject to any retroactive Council restriction or oversight. She stopped. "Questions?" she said. The Council chamber erupted. Not all of it. The loudest voices were the ones with the most invested in the existing order. Goss Toon of the Makari was on his feet before point 2 was finished. His translator box was working hard to keep up with the speed and volume of his objections. The audit demand was unprecedented. The scope was invasive. The time frame was unreasonable. The precedent of granting full status under conditions of active military pressure was a violation of the foundational principles of Council membership. Every species at this table earned membership through merit, through process, through demonstrated cooperation. "Counselor," Vasquez's voice came through the open channel. Flat, patient. "With respect, every species at that table earned membership through whatever process the species already at the table designed. You built the door, you set the height of the handle, and when we showed up and knocked, you scheduled our extinction." A pause. "We're redesigning the door." The chamber erupted again. Vreth Sanok let it run for 2 minutes. Then he raised one hand. Just one. The kind of gesture that works because of the history of the person making it. All the weight of every session he had ever presided over settling into the movement. The room quieted. He looked at his document, the one he had spent 19 hours on, the phased engagement framework, the provisional consultation status pathway, the procedural review proposal. He thought about what Vasquez had said to Chauvel. "You've been watching you since Kepler Station, 40 years, 7 ships, built inside the gap between assumption and verification." He thought about what that required. Not just engineering, not just resources, but patience, discipline. The ability to look at a galaxy full of older, larger civilizations and understand exactly how they thought and use that understanding to create exactly the space needed to do what needed doing. He thought about whether any of that was wrong. The first extraction order he had signed 40 years ago had been for a species called the Vethnar. They had been small, young, fast-growing. The language at the time had been civilizational realignment. The vote had been 39-1. He had cast the deciding vote. The Vethnar were one of the names in the floor. He did not look at the floor. When he looked at Suri, she was sitting quietly, not arguing with anyone. not performing anything. She looked back at him with the clear, careful expression she had been wearing for 2 days and waited. He thought about the 4 abstentions. He thought about what abstaining required. In a room where the majority was certain, and certainty was comfortable, and silence was the safest thing a person could offer. He thought about the document in front of him. He put it in his desk drawer. The council will consider the 3 points as stated, he said. More chaos. Gostun again, louder. 3 other delegates joining. Procedural objections, stacking like the Makari loved to stack them. A wall of process built in real time to slow what they could feel coming. There is no mechanism, Gostun said at full volume. Each word landed separately for emphasis. For immediate full membership status under any condition. The bylaws are clear. Minimum 3 years candidacy review. That is not negotiable. That is foundational. Councillor Gostun, Vasquez said from the open channel. He stopped. The Thermopylae is the first of 7 vessels. She said it without emphasis, which somehow gave it more emphasis than shouting would have. The other 6 are already in position. I sent the coordinates to your science delegation's secure channel about 4 hours ago. I'd check those coordinates before describing anything as foundational. Gostun looked at his communications board. So did 12 other delegates. Vreth Sanok watched the room absorb the coordinates. Watched the calculations happen on 47 different faces. 7 Titan-class vessels, each the size of a small moon, one of which had just stopped 3 warships with minimum power, while simultaneously broadcasting the event to every member species in real time on a frequency nobody could jam. 7 of them. He thought about the reserve fleet, 200 ships. He thought about Velton's intelligence briefing and the 7 permits that nobody had cross-referenced and the question of what else might be in the substructures they had never checked. He thought about minimum setting. The vote, he said. On point 1, someone said. On all 3 points. Together, as a package. He looked around the table. I want a single vote on all 3 together. That was unusual. That was, in fact, strictly speaking, not the standard procedure. Ani Gostun opened his mouth and Vresanak looked at him with an expression that had been winning arguments before Gostun was born, and Gostun closed his mouth. The vote went around the table. It was not unanimous. Gostun voted no. 3 others voted no. The rest voted yes. The count came back 43 in favor, 4 against, no abstentions. Vresanak read the result aloud. He did it clearly and without pause and put it on the record in the official language of the council and in the 7 other formal languages required by bylaws. It took 4 minutes. He did not rush it and he did not slow it. When he finished, the channel was still open. Received, Vasquez said. We'll need the signed resolution transmitted to the Thermopylae on... A brief pause. Actually, on that frequency I used earlier. Why the one that's not in your database? We'll need the address for that frequency, Vresanak said. It's in the coordinates file. Of course it was. He looked at Suri. She was looking at the table. Something had shifted slightly in her expression. Not triumph. She was too experienced for that. Something quieter. The expression of a person who has been carrying the weight of a room's bad idea for a long time and has just felt it lift enough to breathe. He looked at the names carved into the floor. He let himself do it this time. He found the Veth Nar. Their name was small, near the edge where the newer names went. The stone around it was smooth and polished from 40 years of cleaning crews passing over it. Admiral Captain Vasquez, he said. Yes. I would ask one question, not for the record, and for my own understanding. A pause from the other end. Then, go ahead. You knew about the vote before we dispatched the fleet. He chose the words carefully. You anticipated the engagement. You prepared for it. A pause. Why did you not simply reveal the Thermopylae earlier? Before the vote, the knowledge of its existence would have prevented all of this. The channel was quiet for several seconds. When Vasquez answered, her voice was the same, level, unhurried, that particular human quality of sounding like they have thought about this more than they are going to tell you. We wanted to know, she said simply. We needed to see what you would do when nobody was looking and you thought you could. A pause. Now we know. She let that sit for a moment. And transmit the resolution when you're ready. Her voice returned to the practical. And Counselor Vreth Sanok, for whatever it's worth, we're not interested in punishment. were interested in different arrangements going forward. The channel closed. The chamber was quiet. Outside, across a system that humanity had been seeding with infrastructure for 4 decades, the sun rose on a pale blue planet that had spent 63 years being watched by civilizations that had decided what it was before looking at what it was doing. Peth Saran, in his small office on the 14th administrative level, received the session summary automatically. He read the result. He sat with it for a long moment. He filed his original document into the main archive, moved it out of the low-priority folder, and noted on the cover that it had been written 9 days prior and contained a flag that had not been acted on. He was not angry. He was a person who triple-checked things, and the lesson he was taking from today was not that he had been ignored. It was that the checking was right and the low-priority designation had been wrong, and those were two different problems requiring two different solutions. He made a note of that too. In the chamber, Vreth Sanok sat after the delegates filed out, the same way he had sat after the first vote. Same table, same stone, same quiet. The difference was what he was thinking about. Before, he had thought about the names in the floor and decided he had no reason to doubt himself. Now he sat with the fact that humanity had known about the vote before the fleet left, had tracked the fleet through the transit lanes, had built 7 vessels in plain sight inside the gap between what the Council assumed and what it verified, had waited patiently, quietly for 40 years, and then had not destroyed the fleet or overwhelmed the chamber or demanded retribution, had asked for a seat, had asked for consistency, had asked for acknowledgement. He thought about the word rude. He thought about the specific choice of that word, the smallness of it, the human deliberateness of using the smallest possible word for a thing that was very large. Pretty rude. 19 hours, 47 species, the full weight of 4,000 years of galactic governance, and humanity had called it rude and moved on. When there was something in that he did not fully understand and suspected he was going to spend a long time thinking about. He stood up. He had a transmission to authorize. Outside, somewhere past the edges of the system where the Thermopylae sat, humanity was waiting, patient as it turned out in all the ways that mattered, ready as it turned out in all the ways that counted, and watching. It had always been watching.